Welcome to History to Relax, the place where you can unwind, breathe deeply, and drift into the past at a calm, gentle pace. Before we begin tonight's story, I'd like to ask you for a little favor. If you enjoy these journeys through history, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. It's always a joy to see how far these stories travel, and we're so grateful to have you here with us. Now, it's time to slow down. Set aside the noise of the day, sit back, make yourself comfortable, and let your mind wander. Together, we'll step into another time, gently, quietly, one breath at a time. Thank you for joining us. Let's begin. Part 1. A World Transformed. The world changed quietly at first, not with a sudden crash, nor with the roar of armies or the sweep of kings. Instead, it came with the steady beat of hammers, the rumble of wheels, and the slow rise of chimneys that reached for the clouds. Smoke drifted higher into the sky. The steady hum of spinning wheels grew louder. Villages that once echoed with the sound of roosters and church bells began to ring with the constant rhythm of machines. The Industrial Revolution had arrived, and with it, life as ordinary people knew it would never be the same. Before this change, most people lived by the rhythm of the seasons. They worked in the fields, tilled the soil, harvested grain, or spun wool at home. Families worked together, and though it was hard, they knew the pace of their days. The land itself told them when to wake and when to rest. A cold winter slowed work. A bright summer brought longer hours. The natural world, not a clock, set the limits. Work was hard, but it was familiar. If you were a weaver, your loom stood by the window of your cottage, light falling on your hands as you passed the shuttle back and forth. If you were a farmer, you felt the soil beneath your feet, smelled the grain as it ripened, and watched the clouds for signs of rain. A family's labor was tied together, woven into the rhythms of the year. But with the rise of great machines came a new ruler of time. The factory bell. The whistle. The strike of the clock on the wall. For the first time, men, women, and children were expected to live not by sun or season, but by the demands of an endless schedule. The clock became a master harsher than any farmer's sky. Factories rose like giants in towns and cities. Tall chimneys sent black smoke across the sky, covering cobblestone streets in soot. The air was thick, the buildings crowded, and the noise never stopped. Inside, rows upon rows of machines spun, clattered, and hissed. They never grew tired. And so, neither could the people who worked them. The promise of these factories was dazzling, at least to those who owned them. More cloth could be woven in a single week than a family of weavers might manage in a year. Coal burned hotter than wood and kept engines running day and night. Iron and steel made it possible to build faster, bigger, and stronger. The age of hand tools and quiet craft was slipping away. But for the workers, the story was different. These great engines of progress demanded bodies to keep them alive, small hands to tie threads, nimble fingers to catch loose parts, strong backs to shovel coal, tired eyes to watch the machines for endless hours. Behind every shining spool of cloth or roaring locomotive stood men, women, and children who labored until their strength was gone. Imagine stepping into such a city for the first time. The air is heavy, grey with soot. Smoke curls into your lungs with every breath. The streets are packed with people, many in patched clothes, their boots worn thin. Horses pull carts heavy with coal or raw cotton. Children run between them, some carrying baskets, some already pale from days spent indoors. Everywhere, the ground is damp with ash and the walls of buildings are stained black. Step inside a mill, and the noise is deafening. Wooden floors tremble beneath the weight of machines that stretch the length of the room. Long belts whip across the ceiling, spinning great wheels that drive the looms. The air is filled with fibers and dust, so thick it scratches the throat and burns the eyes. Workers lean over their tasks, lips pressed tight, speaking little because their voices would be drowned out anyway. To spend a day inside such a place was to leave with your ears ringing, your clothes coated in lint, and your lungs aching from the air. This was not the world of their parents. Not the quiet farmstead or the small village workshop. It was new, and it was harsh. Yet for many families, there was no choice but to enter it. Rural poverty had driven countless families into the cities. The enclosures of farmland in Britain pushed peasants off the land. Mechanization had replaced the old ways of weaving and spinning at home. To survive, men, women, and even children followed the promise of wages into the shadow of the factories. What they found was not freedom, but dependence. A dependence on the mill owner, on the foreman, and on the whistle that ruled their every hour. In the early years, there were no rules to protect them. No laws limiting how many hours a child could work. No limits to how long a man could be kept at his station. Wages were set low, and any complaint could mean dismissal. There were always others waiting at the gate, desperate for a chance to earn even a few pennies. And so the cycle continued: long days, thin pay, and no rest. The change was not just in the factories themselves, but in the very fabric of life. Villages swelled into towns, towns into cities. Narrow lanes that once carried farmers with wagons now teemed with carts of raw cotton, piles of coal, and workers hurrying to their shifts. Tenements rose quickly, stacked high and close together, housing families in single rooms with thin walls. Where once neighbors had space and soil, now they had soot and shadows. And yet, in the eyes of factory owners and investors, this was progress. The railways stretched across the land, linking coalfields to mills, mills to markets, markets to ports. Goods moved faster than ever before. Fortunes were built, palaces rose, and parliaments celebrated the greatness of industry. But the true cost of this progress was measured not in gold, but in the weariness of the people who made it possible. For the worker, life became an endless trade. Time for wages, strength for survival, childhood for pennies, health for bread. The world had been transformed, for some, into wealth and power, for others, into endless labor. And still, there was no turning back. The old ways of life, the cottage loom, the village commons, the quiet fields, had slipped away. The machine age had come, and it demanded its due. As night fell over these new industrial towns, the glow of gas lamps and furnaces lit the sky. Instead of crickets in the fields, there was the hiss of steam and the groan of iron. Instead of silence, there was the rattle of wheels on cobblestones and the coughs of tired men walking home. The world was different now, and everyone felt it. This was only the beginning. The full weight of the Industrial Revolution, the long hours, the low wages, the lack of rest, and the toll on children would unfold in the years to come. For now, picture that world. The dark smoke rising, the endless clatter of machines, the narrow streets filled with tired faces. A world transformed, not into ease or comfort, but into a struggle that would test the endurance of every worker who entered those factory gates. Part 2. The clock never stops. Time once belonged to the sun, to the rise of dawn, to the fading light of dusk. For centuries, people worked by daylight, pausing when the shadows grew long, resting when the stars came out. The rhythm of nature was a guide, and though life was hard, the hours of labor and the hours of rest felt balanced, like a tide that ebbed and flowed. But with the coming of factories, time was no longer gentle. It was no longer guided by seasons or weather. Instead, time was hammered into rigid pieces, measured by the cold face of a clock, and enforced by the sharp cry of a whistle. The days of natural rhythm gave way to the harsh, mechanical march of industrial time. For the worker, the factory bell became both beginning and end. At dawn, its clang or whistle pulled families from thin mattresses in cramped rooms. It rang again to remind them to hurry through the streets, to line up at the mill gates before the doors closed. To be late was to lose wages, or worse, to be locked out and dismissed. The day stretched before them with no mercy. 12 hours. 14 hours. In some cases, even 16. From the moment the machines began to spin until the final whistle blew, men, women, and children were expected to remain at their stations. Meals were short, often eaten standing, sometimes with hands still coated in soot or cotton lint. Breaks were rare, and there was no such thing as paid rest. The machines set the rhythm, and the workers followed. Spinning frames clicked and rattled, looms thundered, steam engines hissed, and all of it demanded constant attention. If a thread snapped, it had to be tied at once. If coal burned low, it had to be shoveled immediately. If a machine jammed, the worker had to risk fingers, arms, even life itself to put it right, because the factory could not stop. Every second of stillness cost the owner money, and so the people were pushed to keep pace, no matter the toll on their bodies. Imagine standing at your post hour after hour, the roar of machines filling your ears until your head feels stuffed with noise. The air is hot, damp with steam, or thick with choking dust. Your eyes sting. Your back aches. Yet the hands of the clock crawl slowly forward, and the end of the shift seems impossibly far away. Children especially felt the weight of time. Some began their shifts before dawn, barely awake, their legs too short to keep up with the pace of work. They tied threads, swept floors, or carried heavy loads, their bodies still growing yet already weary. For them, childhood was not a time of play, but of endless hours measured by the mill's demands. Many never saw the light of day except in the brief walk to and from the factory gates. In the cities, the streets themselves seemed to live by this new clock. At the crack of dawn, lines of workers filled the narrow lanes, boots tapping on cobblestones as they hurried through the smoke. At midday, the sound of machines roared so loudly it seemed to shake the ground. At night, the whistle's final cry scattered the tired crowds homeward, their faces pale in the glow of gas lamps. And then, only hours later, it began again. There were no holidays, no weekends, no expectation of leisure. A Sunday might bring a few hours of rest for church, but even then, many returned to work before the day was out. The concept of a weekend, 2 days of freedom, time for family or simple rest, was unthinkable. Life was a cycle of labor, sleep, and labor again. The lack of rest left its mark. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Women carried their fatigue into homes where meals still had to be cooked and children cared for. Children themselves nodded off while standing, their heads jerking as they tried to stay awake, sometimes punished by foremen for slowing the pace. The body cried out for pause, but the clock allowed no mercy. Even the natural world seemed to fade under this tyranny of time. The factory windows were often caked with soot, dimming daylight. Workers inside could not see if the sky outside was bright or dark, if it rained or snowed. The seasons lost meaning, swallowed by the sameness of the factory floor. Summer heat brought stifling air inside, winter cold crept in through broken panes, but the hours were unchanged. The machine did not care if the wheat was ripe, if the lambs were born, or if the snow lay deep. The machine demanded only that its gears keep turning, and so the people did. Foremen enforced this discipline with a sharp eye and a harsher hand. Anyone caught pausing too long could be fined. Anyone late could lose a day's wage, or worse. If a worker left early, even for sickness, there was no guarantee they would have a place the next morning. The fear of hunger kept most in line. A missed day meant less bread on the table, less coal for the fire. The whistle was not simply a signal, it was survival. This new relationship with time reshaped families as well. Parents no longer set their children's schedules. The factory did. Families no longer gathered in the evenings to share long stories by the hearth. Instead, many returned too tired to speak, eating quickly before collapsing into sleep. Generations were bound not by the rhythms of nature or tradition, but by the relentless cycle of industrial hours. And yet, despite the exhaustion, people endured. They learned to wake at the whistle, to measure life in shifts, to count pennies earned for each hour. They grew used to the ache in their bones, the ringing in their ears, the blur of days blending together. Time itself had changed shape, becoming something sharp, metallic, and unyielding. It is hard, in our world of weekends and holidays, to imagine such a life. To imagine never knowing when you might rest, never being certain of a free hour, never escaping the call of the factory bell. But for millions of workers, this was reality. A life where the clock never stopped, and every moment was owned by someone else. As night fell, and weary workers shuffled home, they might glance up at the factory's great clock face glowing against the soot-darkened sky. Its hands moved forward without pause, marking another day gone, another day of labor survived. And tomorrow, the same whistle would sound, and the same long hours would begin again. This was the tyranny of time after the Industrial Revolution. A time no longer measured in seasons or sunlight, but in hours sold, bodies bent, and lives consumed by the ticking of a clock that never stopped. Part 3. Pennies for survival. Factories promised wages. That, more than anything, drew men, women, and children into their smoke-filled halls. The posters nailed to wooden gates spoke of steady pay, of coins earned each week, of the chance to put bread on the table. For families driven off the land, or for craftsmen ruined by the new machines, even a few pennies offered hope. But the promise and the reality were never the same. Wages were small, cruelly small, when set against the hours demanded. Men worked 12 or 14 hours a day and might carry home just enough to cover rent for a single damp room. Women earned less, sometimes half of what men received, though their hours were no shorter. And children, despite long days at looms or coal carts, were given only a handful of coins, their pay little more than pocket change for the factory owner. Imagine a man's roughened hand opening at the end of the week to reveal his pay, a few shillings, counted out with care. In another place, a woman receives her wages, folding the coins tightly in her palm, already knowing how quickly they will vanish. There is no joy in it, only a weary calculation. How much for bread? How much for coal? How much to keep a landlord from knocking at the door? Food was the greatest cost, and the poorest food was often all a worker could afford. Bread filled most bellies, thick loaves cut into hard slices, eaten plain or with a smear of drippings if luck allowed. Potatoes boiled in blackened pots stretched the meal further. Meat was rare, a luxury bought only when wages rose above survival, which was not often. Many children grew up pale and thin, their bones frail, their stomachs never quite full. Then there was coal. Every winter, families faced the bitter question, warmth or hunger. A few pennies might buy a small pile of coal, enough to keep a stove glowing weekly through the night. But those same pennies could also buy bread for tomorrow. To burn coal was to eat less. To eat was to freeze more. In many tenements, the air was filled with the smell of damp wood scraps or coal dust, burned carefully, piece by piece, to stretch warmth as long as possible. Rent swallowed another share of every wage. Entire families often lived in a single room, for walls stained with damp, a floor crowded with straw mattresses or broken furniture. Privacy did not exist. Parents, children, even grandparents sometimes crowded into one space, their few belongings stacked in corners, their lives reduced to survival. Landlords cared little for comfort. They cared only that the coins appeared on time. And still, the wages barely held. A week of illness could tip a family into ruin. If a father missed work, there was no pay. If a child fell ill and could not carry coal, there was no money. Debt crept in easily, and once it had its grip, it rarely let go. Families pawned blankets, boots, even wedding rings, just to keep bread in the cupboard another day. The unfairness of wages was made sharper by the fortunes of those above. Mill owners built houses with fine brick fronts and gardens behind tall fences. Their wives wore silk, their children played with toys carved from ivory or polished wood. And all of it was paid for by the pennies scraped from the hands of those who bent over the machines. The contrast was stark and bitter to see. Women bore a special burden in this economy of survival. They worked long hours in the mills, then returned to rooms where food still had to be prepared, children soothed, water carried, and washing done. Their pay was meager, but without it, the family could not last. Many worked until the day of childbirth and returned days later, the wages too vital to forego. Their coins were counted not as extra, but as essential, each penny a thin thread keeping the family alive. Children, too, carried their share of this survival. Their wages, tiny as they were, often made the difference between a loaf of bread or an empty stomach. Parents who once might have dreamed of education for their children instead led them to the mill gates, because without their earnings, the family could not endure. Childhood was traded for bread, laughter exchanged for survival. The smallness of these wages meant that leisure was almost unknown. A penny spent on a newspaper was a penny not spent on bread. A coin dropped at the alehouse could mean an empty coal bin. Families lived by constant arithmetic, weighing every choice against hunger and cold. Some tried to stretch their coins by buying food of the poorest quality, bread mixed with chalk or alum, milk watered down until it was thin as rain. The markets of industrial towns were filled with such cheap goods, their low cost masking their danger. Stomachs were filled, but health withered. The weak became weaker, the frail more frail. And so survival itself became a kind of labor, equal to the hours spent at the loom or shovel. Counting pennies, cutting bread into thin slices, deciding whether to burn coal or save it, whether to pawn a blanket or hold it against the cold. Every decision was edged with fear, because one wrong choice might mean hunger, sickness, or eviction. The factory owners claimed they paid a fair wage. They argued that without the mills, families would have nothing. But for the workers, it never felt like fairness. It felt like chains, not iron chains, but the constant weight of poverty, binding them just as tightly. And yet, people endured. They learned to make soup from bones, to stitch and restitch worn clothes, to patch shoes with scraps of leather. They sang songs quietly in the evenings, children listening while gnawing on crusts of bread. They found ways to laugh, even in slums. Survival was hard, but it was not joyless. The human spirit, though pressed, did not vanish. Still, the truth remained. The wages of the Industrial Revolution were not enough to live well. They were barely enough to live at all. Every loaf of bread, every lump of coal, every ragged boot worn thin was bought with sweat, with hours stolen from sleep, with the labor of small hands and tired backs. This was the meaning of those pennies. They were not coins of silver or gold, not tokens of progress or pride. They were survival itself, fragile, uncertain, and never enough. And tomorrow, as the whistle blew again, more hours would be traded for more pennies, the cycle unbroken. For the workers, this was life. Survival bought one coin at a time. Part 4. No rest for the poor. Rest is something most people today expect. A Sunday afternoon stretched out with family. A holiday when work is left behind. A weekend to breathe, to recover, to feel human again. But for the first generations of industrial workers, such ideas were little more than dreams. Life was consumed by labor, and the little time left was barely enough to eat, sleep, and prepare for the next day's shift. The factory bell carved life into long blocks of labor and thin slivers of recovery. 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours at the machines, and then home to rooms crowded with family, where exhaustion wrapped itself around every corner. The body ached, the mind dulled, and still the next morning waited with another whistle, another demand to begin again. There were no official holidays for the working poor. No paid time away, no recognition that the human body and spirit need pause. The wealthy might speak of leisure, of seaside visits, of summer trips to country houses. The factory workers, however, measured their year only in shifts. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, months into years, each marked by the same whistle at dawn and the same whistle at night. Sunday was the one exception, but even that was stolen in part. By law or custom, many mills gave workers a half-day, freeing them for church in the morning. Yet by afternoon, the factory might call them back again. The day of rest became a day of hurry, rushing through prayers, hurrying home, then back to the loom or the furnace before the sun had set. What should have been sacred, a day to gather, to breathe, to simply exist outside the factory walls, was reduced to another fragment of labor. For children, there was almost no break at all. They worked long hours alongside adults, and when the Sunday school movement began, it was not a holiday but another form of duty. Boys and girls, weary from 6 days of labor, trudged into crowded rooms to learn their letters and recite verses. Education was noble, perhaps, but it came at the cost of the only day they might have rested. The absence of leisure pressed heavily on families. Parents returned home too tired to speak, too weary to tell stories or play with children. Meals were taken in silence, heads bowed not in prayer but in sheer exhaustion. Laughter was rare, conversation short, songs sung only faintly before sleep overcame them. Life outside the factory shrank to the narrowest margins, little more than an extension of survival. Imagine a man, his shoulders stooped from lifting, walking home at night. His boots are coated with dust, his hands black with coal. He pushes open the door to a dim room where his family waits. His children climb onto his knees, eager for a moment of affection. He tries to smile, but his eyes close, his head falls forward. Sleep claims him in the middle of their chatter. The children slip away quietly, used to this. Their father is home, but he is not truly present. The same story repeats for women, though their burden was doubled. After hours in the mills or factories, they returned home not to rest but to work again. Water had to be fetched, food prepared, laundry washed by hand. Infants cried to be fed, children needed care. Their bodies longed for stillness, but duty stretched on, unbroken. Rest was not a right, not even an expectation. It was a luxury rarely tasted. For many, the only respite came in sleep, but even this was uncertain. Rooms were cramped, often with entire families pressed into one space. Noise carried through thin walls. Beds were shared, mattresses lumpy, and blankets too few for cold nights. Restless coughing, the cries of babies, the snores of the exhausted, all filled the air, denying the deep sleep the body craved. People awoke nearly as tired as when they lay down. The lack of rest carved itself into the body. Eyes grew hollow. Backs bent before their time. Joints ached. Illness spread quickly, made worse by fatigue. The body has limits, and when pushed past them, it begins to falter. For workers, however, there was no choice but to carry on, no matter how worn they became. To stop was to risk hunger, eviction, or death. Leisure, when it could be snatched, often took the form of small gatherings. Families might sing quietly around a fire, children clapping their hands to simple tunes. Men might slip into alehouses for a brief moment of cheer, though every coin spent there was a coin lost to bread or coal. Women might gossip at the water pump, their chatter a moment of relief from endless duty. These moments were fleeting, fragile, stolen from the relentless pace of work. The wealthy sometimes looked down upon the poor, claiming they wasted what little free time they had. They sneered at alehouses, at music halls, at simple pleasures. Yet these moments were not waste. They were survival, a way to keep spirits alive in a world that allowed so little breathing room. Even festivals and fairs, once the bright sparks of village life, dimmed under industrial time. Where once communities gathered for harvest feasts or midsummer dances, factory schedules now intruded. The whistle called, and the fields or fairs emptied. Tradition bent to industry, and the joy of communal rest faded. The absence of holidays did more than exhaust bodies. It shaped minds. Workers came to believe that unbroken labor was simply life, that endless fatigue was natural. Generations grew up never knowing the freedom of leisure, never imagining a world where time might belong to them. The idea that work could stop, even briefly, seemed almost impossible. And yet, within this harshness, seeds of change began to stir. Some reformers argued that workers needed true rest, not as a gift, but as a necessity. They pointed to accidents in mills, injuries caused by fatigue, illnesses worsened by exhaustion. They claimed that rest was not indulgence but safety, not weakness but survival. Their voices were small, at first, but they carried the first whispers of a world where leisure might be seen as a right, not a crime. For now, though, the workers knew little of such hope. Their days stretched on, broken only by sleep, and even that was poor and thin. Leisure was not theirs to claim. It belonged to the wealthy, the powerful, the fortunate. For the rest, there was only labor, day after day, week after week, year after year. Picture again the narrow street of an industrial town. Gas lamps flicker, their glow fighting against the soot dark night. Workers shuffle home, boots scuffing on cobblestones. Windows shine faintly where families gather, their light dim and tired. A moment later, the lamps gutter, and darkness takes the street. Inside those crowded rooms, men, women, and children collapse onto beds, knowing that in only a few hours the whistle will call again. There is no holiday waiting, no weekend to soften the weeks. There is only tomorrow, and the day after, and the one after that. A life without rest. A life where leisure is a dream. And still, they endured. Because endurance itself was their only form of rest, the slow, stubborn survival of people who had little choice but to keep going. Their bodies bent, their spirits thinned, but still they walked back to the mill gates each morning, answering the call of a world that gave them no pause. This was the life of the industrial worker, not only endless hours, not only meager wages, but a life stripped of leisure, stripped of rest. A life where the poor were never truly allowed to stop. Part 5. Children of the Mills. Childhood, in most times and places, is meant to be a season of play. A time of running in fields, chasing games, and learning slowly at the knee of a parent. But in the shadow of the Industrial Revolution, childhood was cut short. For countless boys and girls, the factory gates closed upon them as tightly as they did upon their parents, and childhood itself became a form of labor. Factories did not simply accept children, they demanded them. The machines were vast, but they were filled with small spaces where only little bodies could fit. Threads needed nimble fingers, spindles required quick hands, and coal mines needed boys thin enough to crawl through narrow tunnels. Children became part of the machinery, their growth, their laughter, even their health bent to serve the iron engines of industry. Most began work at the age of 7 or 8, some even younger. A boy who should have been learning letters might instead be dragging coal wagons on his hands and knees. A girl who should have been playing with dolls or skipping rope might instead stand for 14 hours tying broken threads in a spinning frame. Their wages were pitiful, barely a handful of coins, yet their labor was considered essential. Without them, the machines slowed, the profits dipped. Imagine a small child standing on a stool to reach the loom, her fingers darting in and out of moving parts. The machine clatters and shakes, its belts whipping above her head. One slip, one moment of hesitation, and her fingers could be crushed or torn away. There is no pause, no mercy. The foreman paces the floor, watching, shouting, making sure no child lingers too long. In coal mines, boys known as trappers spent long days alone in darkness, opening and shutting wooden doors to allow air to flow through tunnels. Their only light was a weak lamp, their only company the dripping of water and the echo of distant picks. Hours passed in silence, broken only when they crawled on all fours to drag heavy wagons of coal, their backs bent, their knees raw. Children in glassworks carried glowing lumps of molten material, the heat scorching their skin. Others in match factories dipped sticks into toxic chemicals that burned their throats and poisoned their teeth. The tasks varied from industry to industry, but the toll was always the same. Childhood traded for labor, laughter smothered by exhaustion. The hours for children were no shorter than for adults. 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours stood between the first bell and the last. They rose before dawn, stumbling through streets with eyes still heavy with sleep. They returned home after dark, too tired to eat, collapsing onto straw mattresses beside siblings who carried the same weariness. For them, the cycle of day and night was blurred, every hour claimed by work. Education was almost impossible. Some reformers founded Sunday schools, hoping to give children at least a chance to read and write. But even this was not rest. Children who had worked 6 days in a mill or mine trudged to a cold classroom on the 7th, their heads drooping, their minds too tired to learn. Many learned only enough to sign their names, their schooling stolen by the demands of industry. The dangers of such labor were constant. Fingers caught in gears, limbs pulled into belts, lungs filled with dust and fibers. Burns, breaks, cuts, and bruises were so common they became ordinary, barely noticed by owners who considered children cheap to replace. Some children did not survive at all, their small bodies crushed by machines or weakened until illness carried them off. Those who lived often bore the marks forever: twisted spines, missing fingers, lungs scarred by soot. Parents often felt the weight of guilt, but poverty left little choice. A father's wages alone could not feed a family, and so children were sent to earn what they could. Mothers wept as they led their young ones to factory doors, but they knew that without those coins, there would be no bread, no coal, no survival. Children became not just workers but lifelines, their small earnings the difference between hunger and endurance. Childhood games still existed, but they were brief, hurried things. A boy might roll a hoop down a smoky street for a few minutes before the next shift. A girl might sing a skipping rhyme with friends in the moments before the mill bell rang. But laughter was short, joy cut off by the whistle's command. Childhood was fragmented, reduced to stolen scraps between hours of labor. And yet, even in this harsh world, children carried resilience. They made games of their tasks, turning the tying of threads into contests, racing one another to sweep floors quickly, singing songs over the roar of looms. Their spirits bent but did not always break. In the darkest minds, boys invented stories to tell one another, tales of heroes and dragons, their voices echoing down tunnels lit only by faint lamps. But such resilience came at a cost. Many never grew to full height, their bodies stunted by malnutrition and strain. Others aged too quickly, their faces lined with care before they reached their teens. Some, worn down by injury or illness, died before adulthood. A generation of children lived half-lives, shaped more by the mill and the mine than by home or play. The wealthy sometimes spoke with pride of industrious youth, praising the discipline of children who labored like adults. They claimed that work built character, that it kept boys and girls from idleness. But beneath these words was a harder truth. Industry did not build character, it consumed it. It devoured strength, spirit, and joy, leaving behind bodies that were used and worn before their time. In time, reformers began to notice. Writers described the pale faces of mill children, the hollow coughs of mining boys, the tiny coffins carried through crowded streets. Campaigns arose, calling for laws to limit the hours children could work, to set a minimum age for labor. Their voices grew slowly louder, planting the seeds of change. But in the early years, when industry was at its fiercest, children were still the cheapest, most vulnerable part of the workforce, and the mills depended on them. Picture, for a moment, a child lying down to sleep after such a day. His hands are scratched, his knees bruised, his lungs aching with dust. He curls beside his siblings in the narrow bed, too tired to dream. Tomorrow the whistle will sound again, and he will rise once more, shoulders heavy with labor that should never have been his to carry. This was childhood in the age of industry. Not a time of wonder, not a season of growth, but a long march of work, fatigue, and survival. The mills did not simply consume coal and cotton. They consumed childhood itself. Part 6. The Machinery of Pain. Factories were built to produce goods, but in their heart, they were machines of risk. Every gear, every belt, every spinning blade was a threat waiting to strike. For the owners, machines meant profit. For the workers, they meant danger. To walk into a mill, a mine, or a foundry was to step into a world where one slip, one stumble, one moment's fatigue could cost fingers, limbs, or even life. The roar of the factory floor was not only sound, it was menace. Spinning frames rattled with restless energy, their wooden teeth snapping threads as fast as human hands could repair them. Great looms thundered in lines, their shuttles darting back and forth with whip-like speed. Belts stretched overhead, whirling across pulleys with enough force to lift a man from his feet. To work among them was to live on edge, every sense straining against disaster. Children, small and quick, were often ordered to crawl under machines to sweep lint or repair broken threads while the wheels still spun. Their bodies disappeared into the shadows beneath moving frames, their tiny hands darting in and out between sharp teeth. Sometimes they returned, triumphant, with threads fixed or debris cleared. Sometimes they did not return whole. Fingers torn away, hair caught and ripped from the scalp, arms crushed before they could pull free. The machinery demanded speed, and accidents were its toll. Adults were not spared. A man shoveling coal might stumble and fall into open gears. A woman leaning too close to her loom might have her clothing caught, pulling her in before she could scream. In the foundries, molten iron splashed from ladles, scalding skin in an instant. In glassworks, boys and men carried glowing blobs of fire on long poles, a single misstep burning flesh beyond repair. Injuries were not rare exceptions. They were part of the daily rhythm. There were no guards on the machines, no safety rails, no emergency stops. Once the belts began to spin, they did not stop until the whistle blew. Foremen shouted at workers to be quick, to move faster, to ignore fatigue. "The machine cannot wait," they said, though it was the machine that never tired, never hesitated, never bled. When accidents happened, sympathy was rare. A missing hand might mean dismissal, the worker judged useless without it. Compensation was unheard of. Families bore the burden, patching wounds with rags, carrying their injured back to rooms already too crowded, already too poor. A boy with crushed fingers became a beggar. A girl with a mangled arm became a burden her family struggled to feed. The scars of the machinery were everywhere in industrial towns. Men walked with limps, their legs twisted from breaks never properly set. Women bore missing fingers, their hands curled from burns or cuts. Children coughed weakly, their lungs already weakened by dust or smoke. Entire streets seemed marked by injury, as if the factory had left its stamp upon each body that served it. Even without sudden accidents, the machinery inflicted slower wounds. The endless repetition of tasks wore joints down, bent spines, and strained muscles. A man who carried loads of coal each day found his back curved, his knees weakened before middle age. A woman who bent over looms hour after hour found her eyesight fading, her shoulders stiff, her fingers trembling with pain. Fatigue became injury in slow motion, creeping across the years until strength was gone. Breathing itself was dangerous. Cotton mills filled the air with fibers that floated like snow, catching in the throat, burrowing deep into lungs. Workers coughed constantly, spitting blood, their chests rattling with each breath. In coal mines, dust thickened the air, blackening lungs until men wheezed in the dark. In match factories, poisonous fumes ate away at teeth and jawbones, a slow death known grimly as phossy jaw. The machinery did not only crush and cut, it poisoned and weakened, marking every breath with risk. And still, the workers returned each day. They had no choice. Hunger pressed them forward, rent demanded coins, children cried for bread. A man missing 2 fingers still showed up at the mill, because the pennies were worth more than his pain. A child with bandaged arms still limped back to the factory gate, because without her coins, her family would starve. The machinery consumed bodies, but poverty forced them back again. Picture a loom hall at midday. The air is thick with dust, the light dim through soot-coated windows. Rows of workers bend over their machines, their hands darting quickly, their eyes straining to keep pace. Suddenly, a shout cuts through the roar. A boy cries out, his hand caught in a shuttle. Blood splatters the wood, the machines thunder on, and the foreman rushes over. For a moment, the hall trembles with horror. And then, just as quickly, the rhythm resumes. The boy is carried away, the machines roar on, and life continues, as if pain itself was simply another cog in the system. This was the cruel truth. The machinery of industry did not pause for human suffering. Injuries were not exceptions to progress. They were part of its price. Each bolt of cloth, each shovel of coal, each iron rail carried within it the hidden cost of broken fingers, crushed limbs, scarred lungs. The goods of the new age gleamed with innovation, but they were stained with the pain of those who produced them. For the owners, accidents were regrettable, but not costly. There were always more workers waiting at the gate, more children desperate for pennies, more men and women too poor to refuse. The injured disappeared into silence, and the machines rolled on. And yet, within this machinery of pain, the strength of the workers was undeniable. They endured wounds, lived with scars, carried burdens that would have broken others. Their bodies bent, but their spirits often held. They laughed when they could, they told stories of survival, they comforted one another in the dark rooms where pain lingered. Though the machinery sought to consume them, it could not erase the stubborn spark of human endurance. Still, the scars remained. A town could be read by its injuries, a missing arm here, a limp there, a cough echoing down the street. The machinery wrote its history on flesh, and entire generations bore its marks. This was the reality of life in the industrial age. The factory was not just a place of labor. It was a place of danger, of wounds, of endless risk. It was the machinery of pain, grinding forward with no thought of those who fed it. And tomorrow, as always, the workers would return, stepping once more into the roar of danger, because survival demanded it. The machinery waited, and the people had no choice but to serve. Part 7. Smoke, Dust, and Darkness. The Industrial Revolution did not only change work. It changed the very air people breathed, the skies they looked at, and the ground beneath their feet. To live in an industrial town was to live in smoke, to walk through dust, to carry soot home on your skin and in your lungs. The environment itself became a kind of factory, one that reached into every home, every meal, every breath. Factories belched smoke from tall chimneys, their black plumes spreading across towns like storm clouds that never lifted. Coal was the lifeblood of industry, but its gift was poison. Each shovel burned sent soot into the sky, falling back onto streets, rooftops, and the faces of children playing outside. By midday, the sky was often gray. By evening, the air was thick as fog, only darker, more bitter, carrying the taste of ash on the tongue. Walking through such a town was like walking through smoke that never cleared. Soot clung to clothing, settling in every crease and seam. Hands were blackened no matter how often they were washed. Even bread bought at the market bore a faint dusting of ash. Mothers wiped soot from their children's cheeks, only to see it return before the day was done. Cleanliness was a battle already lost before it began. Inside the mills, the air was worse still. Cotton fibers drifted endlessly, floating like pale snowflakes that scratched throats and filled lungs. Workers coughed through their shifts, wiping their mouths with rags, spitting blood into corners. Coal dust lay thick in the mines, coating every surface, turning even young boys into grey shadows of themselves. In ironworks, the air shimmered with heat, carrying sharp, metallic fumes that burned with every breath. Breathing itself became labor, a constant struggle against the filth that industry poured into the air. The human body could not withstand such conditions without protest. Lungs grew weak, rattling with every cough. Mill cough became a phrase spoken with grim familiarity, describing the hacking sickness that consumed countless workers. Black lung followed miners into their graves, while phossy jaw rotted the mouths of match workers. Death was not sudden, but slow, stretched across years of coughing, wheezing, and gasping for air. Darkness became a companion as well. Thick smoke blotted out sunlight, leaving towns in a half-shadow even at noon. Windows were smeared with soot, streets dim under layers of grime. Children grew up pale, their skin never kissed by clean light. For many, the sun was something glimpsed briefly, between factory gates and crowded alleys, before the haze swallowed it again. And in this gloom, the houses of the poor stood close together, their walls damp, their roofs leaking soot-stained rain. Tenements were built quickly and cheaply, with no thought for fresh air or clean water. Rooms were small, windows few, and the air inside was stale and heavy. Smoke from coal stoves only added to the choking atmosphere, filling lungs that were already overworked by dust. For families, there was no escape. The factory air followed them home, clinging to their clothes, seeping into every corner of their rooms. Illness spread easily in such places. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, cholera, all found fertile ground in lungs and stomachs already weakened by filth. Children coughed endlessly, their chests rattling through the night. Mothers whispered prayers over cribs where babies struggled for breath. Fathers wheezed as they tried to sleep, their bodies worn down not only by labor but by the air itself. The environment shaped mood as well as health. Darkness weighed on spirits. Days without sunshine left people weary, their minds clouded. The endless gray pressed down like a heavy blanket, smothering joy. Even when laughter rose in crowded streets, it was muted, dulled by the haze that swallowed sound as easily as it swallowed light. Yet, amid the smoke, people adapted as best they could. Women hung laundry in narrow alleys, knowing it would return spotted with soot but hoping it might dry before the next cloud rolled in. Children played in streets regardless, their faces streaked black, their eyes bright with mischief. Men carried on with work, their boots kicking up dust that joined the smoke already swirling around them. Life continued, even when the air itself fought against it. The wealthy sometimes spoke of progress when they looked at the smoky skies, claiming the smoke was the sign of prosperity, the badge of a strong nation. Where there's smoke, there's industry, they said, as though the choking haze were a flag to be waved with pride. But for the workers who lived beneath it, the smoke was not prosperity. It was suffering, plain and sharp, settling into their lungs, their homes, their very bones. Picture, for a moment, a mother standing in the doorway of her tenement. Behind her, the room is dim, its single lamp casting faint light over her sleeping children. Outside, the street is shrouded in haze, the lamps along the road glowing faintly like candles seen through fog. She coughs, pulls her shawl tighter, and glances at the sky, though no stars are visible. There is only smoke, only darkness, only the endless breath of industry, drifting down to smother her town. This was the world of smoke, dust, and darkness. A world where air itself became the enemy, where lungs carried the weight of industry as surely as hands carried tools. For workers, survival meant not only enduring long hours and meager wages, but also living in an environment that drained strength day after day, breath after breath. And tomorrow, as chimneys roared once more and machines clattered to life, the haze would rise again, blotting out the sun, settling over the streets, pressing into every home. The people would cough, wipe their eyes, and continue, because there was no escape, and survival demanded nothing less. Part 8. A Home in Shadows. Work did not end at the factory gates. For the poor of the industrial towns, the hardships followed them home, seeping through doorways and settling into every corner. The rooms where workers slept, ate, and raised families were not havens of rest, but crowded spaces of damp walls, stale air, and shadows that seemed to press closer each night. Industrial growth brought workers into cities faster than houses could be built. Streets once lined with cottages or open fields filled quickly with rows of hastily constructed tenements. Builders worked cheaply, packing families into narrow brick boxes stacked side by side, their walls thin, their windows small. These houses were not designed for comfort, they were designed for profit. Landlords charged high rents for the smallest rooms, knowing demand was endless. For many, home meant a single room, perhaps 12 feet square, where an entire family lived. Parents, children, and sometimes grandparents shared the space, their beds little more than straw mattresses laid on the floor. Privacy did not exist. Meals, sleep, birth, sickness, and death all took place within the same four walls. The air inside was heavy with the smells of cooking, sweat, coal smoke, and damp plaster. In winter, frost formed on the inside of windows. In summer, the heat trapped itself, suffocating in clothes. Water was scarce. Few homes had pumps of their own, and most families shared a single public pump at the end of the street. Long lines formed at dawn, women and children waiting with buckets while the stronger pushed ahead. The water was often unclean, drawn from sources polluted by sewage or industrial waste. A sip might carry disease. Yet there was no choice. Thirst did not wait for purity. Sewage ran openly through gutters, carrying waste down narrow streets where children played. The stench rose in waves, mingling with smoke from chimneys and the smell of rotting refuse. Flies swarmed, rats scurried, and disease found a constant foothold. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, these names haunted the slums, whispered like curses as neighbors watched families sicken and fade. Light was scarce inside the homes. Windows were tiny, often smeared with soot from outside. Curtains were rare, glass sometimes cracked, and many rooms sank into gloom even at midday. Gas lamps were too expensive for the poor, so families relied on candles or the dim glow of a small fire. Shadows filled corners, flickering across walls, giving the rooms a constant sense of night. Children grew up in half-darkness, their eyes straining to adjust, their minds shaped by the narrowness of their surroundings. Furniture was minimal, a wooden stool, a battered table, perhaps a chest where clothes were stored. Beds were shared by 3, 4, even 5 people, bodies pressed together for warmth. Infants slept beside older siblings, their cries echoing in the tight space. A single blanket might cover them all, patched so many times it was more stitch than cloth. Meals were eaten quickly, often from shared bowls. Bread and potatoes made up most dinners, with a thin stew if meat could be afforded. The fire that cooked food also warmed the room, its smoke curling into rafters, leaving black stains on the ceiling. Families huddled around it in winter, their faces lit by flickering flames, their bodies aching from the cold that pressed in through thin walls. Sickness spread swiftly in such conditions. A cough in one corner became a cough in all. A fever passed from child to child, parent to parent, until the entire household lay weakened. Doctors were expensive, medicines rare, so families relied on remedies, poultices, teas, whispered prayers. Sometimes they worked. Often, they did not. Death was a frequent visitor in the shadows of these homes. Small coffins were carried out with heartbreaking regularity, borne by neighbors down narrow streets to crowded churchyards. Noise, too, was inescapable. Walls were thin, and every sound carried. The cries of infants mixed with arguments between parents, with the coughs of the sick, with the clatter of boots outside. Sleep was often broken, restless, and shallow. Even in their own homes, workers could not find peace. And yet, amid the shadows, people found ways to endure. Mothers sang lullabies to children, their voices soft against the roar of factories outside. Families shared stories, passing down memories of village life, of green fields left behind, of traditions fading in the smoke. Neighbors supported one another, sharing bread, watching children, helping the sick. In streets lined with hardship, bonds of community offered the only light. Children carved games out of narrow alleys, chasing hoops, skipping ropes, or playing with sticks and stones. Their laughter rose above the stench, brief sparks of joy in streets otherwise filled with gloom. Men gathered in alehouses when coins allowed, finding cheer in company, songs, and the taste of beer. Women spoke at water pumps, sharing burdens, offering advice, holding one another up against the weight of daily struggle. But still, the shadows ruled. For every spark of light, There was the heaviness of damp air, the gnaw of hunger, the fear of illness, the press of too many bodies in too small a space. The home, which should have been a refuge, was instead another battleground in the endless fight for survival. The wealthy, passing by in carriages, sometimes wrinkled their noses at the stench of the slums. They spoke of laziness, of dirt, of the supposed failings of the poor. Few understood that poverty left no choice. Cleanliness required water, space, money, luxuries the workers did not possess. The shadows of their homes were not chosen. They were imposed by a system that demanded labor but offered little in return. Picture one of these homes at night. A single candle flickers, throwing faint light over a family gathered close. The father sits wearily, his head bowed, his hands still black from coal. The mother rocks a baby, her eyes heavy with fatigue. Two children curl on a mattress, already asleep, their bodies pressed together for warmth. The air is thick, the room dim, the shadows deep. Outside, smoke drifts across the street, and the sound of coughing carries from a neighbor's window. This is home, not comfort, not rest, but survival. This was life in the homes of industrial workers. Rooms too small, air too foul, water too dirty, light too faint. A home in shadows, where every breath, every cough, every moment of rest carried the weight of hardship. And still, the people endured. They endured because they had no choice, because endurance itself became a kind of strength. They carried on in the shadows, waiting for dawn, waiting for another day, waiting for survival to stretch just a little further. Part 9. Women in the mills. The Industrial Revolution did not only reshape men's lives. It reached into the lives of women just as deeply, perhaps even more so. For countless wives, mothers, daughters, and sisters, the factory gates opened into a world of endless demands, demands that stretched from the spinning rooms and weaving floors back into their own kitchens and narrow homes. If men bore the weight of hours and wages, women bore the weight of two worlds at once. Women entered the mills in vast numbers. Their fingers were considered nimble, their patience steady, their pay cheap. Factory owners praised their delicate touch, a phrase that masked a harsher truth. Women were employed because they could be paid less. A man might earn a shilling, but a woman doing the same task often earned half, sometimes even less. The wage was justified by owners as supplemental, as though women's earnings were only to add to a husband's pay. But for many families, the woman's wage was not extra, it was essential. Without it, there would be no bread, no coal, no rent. The work itself was no lighter for women. In textile mills, they stood shoulder to shoulder at looms, their eyes straining to catch broken threads, their hands darting quickly to tie knots. In match factories, they dipped sticks into phosphorus, the fumes eating into their jaws and teeth. In pottery works, they glazed plates and cups, the lead in the glazes seeping silently into their bodies. Women carried coal, loaded wagons, stitched in dim workshops. The idea that their work was gentle or light was a fiction told by those who never felt the ache in their shoulders, the sting in their lungs, the tremble in their fingers after 14 hours on their feet. And when the long day ended, their labor was not done. Unlike many men, who returned home to collapse in silence, women returned home to continue working. Water had to be fetched, food prepared, laundry washed by hand in icy water, infants soothed, children fed, sick family members cared for. The factory whistle might mark the end of paid labor, but unpaid labor stretched on deep into the night. For women, there was no true end of work, no line where duty stopped. The double burden pressed down with unrelenting weight. Imagine a woman rising before dawn. She wakes children, prepares a crust of bread, ties her hair in a scarf. She walks quickly to the mill, works until her body aches, then hurries home after dark. Her arms lift a baby, her hands knead dough, her voice hushes children to sleep. She collapses finally into bed, only to rise again before the next dawn. Her life is an unbroken circle of labor, her moments of stillness stolen only in sleep. The dangers women faced in the mills were no less severe than men's. Loose hair or skirts were easily caught in moving machinery. Fingers, arms, even lives were lost in the blink of an eye. In mines, women sometimes hauled coal in heavy carts, straps cutting into their shoulders, their backs bent under the load. They worked in darkness, their bodies straining like beasts of burden. For some, childbirth itself came between shifts, with women returning to work days later, their bodies not yet healed. Illness was constant. The phosphorus in match factories caused a condition known grimly as phossy jaw, where bones decayed, faces swelled, and pain became unbearable. Leading glazes poisoned blood slowly, weakening bodies over years. Dust from cotton clogged lungs, leaving women coughing, their voices rough and broken. Fatigue wrapped itself around them, but still they continued, because the pennies were needed. Despite their burdens, women often held families together. Their meager wages stretched miraculously to cover bread, rent, and coal. They patched clothes, mended boots, made soup from scraps, found remedies for the sick. Their resilience kept families alive when every coin seemed too small, every loaf too thin. In the darkest of tenements, it was often a mother's hands that held everything together. Women also bore the weight of society's judgment. They were accused of neglecting children by working in mills, yet judged as lazy if they stayed home and lived on a husband's small wage. Their morality was questioned if they walked alone to work, their respectability doubted if they shared crowded rooms with strangers. No matter what they did, criticism followed, as though their labor was a flaw rather than a necessity. Still, there was strength in their endurance. Women formed bonds on the factory floor, supporting one another through long hours. They shared food, advice, and comfort. Older women looked after younger ones, teaching them to tie threads quickly, to avoid the watchful eyes of harsh foremen, to hide exhaustion. Together they carried the invisible weight of survival, finding courage in one another's presence. In some towns, women even began to raise their voices. They joined early protests, stood in front of mills demanding shorter hours, spoke out against unsafe conditions. Their courage was met with hostility, even violence, but it marked the first flickers of resistance. Though their voices were quiet, they carried forward into the growing movement for labor rights, planting seeds of change that would one day grow. Picture, for a moment, a row of women at looms in the dim light of a mill hall. Their faces are pale, their hair tied back, their hands moving quickly over threads. The machines thunder, the air is filled with dust, but they work steadily, eyes fixed, shoulders tight. The foreman paces behind them, watching, but they keep on, hour after hour. And later, when the whistle finally blows, they will carry baskets of coal or buckets of water home, their labor continuing into the night. This was the life of women in the mills: long hours, low wages, double burdens, constant danger. And yet, they endured. Their resilience was not celebrated in books or speeches, but it lived in every loaf of bread they baked, every child they soothed, every penny they earned. They were the quiet backbone of industrial towns, holding together families and communities in the face of relentless hardship. The history of the Industrial Revolution is often told through machines, inventions, and great fortunes. But it cannot be understood without the women who labored in its shadows, who spun the threads, hauled the coal, dipped the matches, cooked the meals, raised the children, and survived against odds that seemed impossible. They lived not only in the mills, but in the kitchens of cramped homes, in the alleys filled with soot, in the spaces where survival was stitched together day by day. Their story is not only one of suffering, but of quiet, enduring strength. And tomorrow, as the whistle blew again, women would return to their looms and furnaces, their burdens unbroken, their endurance tested yet again. Because survival left no choice, and endurance itself became their greatest act of defiance. Part 10. Broken Spirits, Silent Cries. The body can endure much. It bends under heavy loads, it grows calloused from hard labor, it adapts to long hours and poor food. But the spirit, too, has its limits. For many who lived and labored in the early decades of the Industrial Revolution, the greatest wound was not always on the hands or lungs, but deep within, a quiet exhaustion of the heart, a heaviness of the soul. Factories demanded more than sweat. They demanded submission. Each day, workers gave not only their strength, but their will. The whistle stripped them of choice, forcing them to rise at dawn whether their bodies were ready or not. The endless roar of machines left no space for thought or conversation. The strict eyes of foremen reduced them to cogs in a greater mechanism. Piece by piece, the sense of being fully human wore thin, until many felt more like extensions of the machines they served. Fatigue was constant. It wrapped itself around every moment, not only in aching muscles but in the mind itself. The long hours blurred days together into an unbroken line, robbing people of joy, of hope, of imagination. Life became survival, stripped of brightness. The laughter of children faded, the chatter of families shrank, and a deep quiet settled over industrial towns. There was little room for dreams. For a man whose wages barely covered bread, thoughts of a better life seemed distant, unreachable. For a woman who labored both in the mill and at home, rest itself was a luxury she might never taste. For a child whose hands tied threads until they bled, the future was simply more of the same. More shifts, more dust, more years lost to labor. Hope grew thin, fragile as a thread about to snap. Silence became the language of suffering. Inside mills, voices were drowned by machinery, so workers spoke less and less. At home, exhaustion pressed words from their mouths, leaving families to eat in near silence. In streets darkened by smoke, men walked with heads bent, women with shawls pulled close, children too tired to play. The cries of the spirit were rarely loud, but they were constant, carried in weary eyes, in stooped shoulders, in the heavy quiet of entire neighborhoods. Despair crept in easily. Some men sought relief in drink, their wages slipping away in alehouses, their silence broken only by bitter songs or muttered complaints. Some women wept in secret, holding infants close while wondering how long they could go on. Children, too, carried silent burdens, their play turned into chores, their joy dulled by fatigue. Depression, though not yet named as we call it today, spread like an invisible sickness, leaving people hollow. Accidents, poverty, illness, these were visible. But the invisible weight of despair was just as deadly. A worker could survive with missing fingers, with a limp, even with lungs scarred by dust. But when the spirit broke, survival itself grew harder. Families drifted apart under the strain. Friendships faded, laughter diminished, and entire communities carried the hush of hopelessness. And yet, amid the silence, small sparks remained. Workers found ways to comfort one another, a hand on a shoulder after a long shift, a whispered word of encouragement, a shared loaf of bread between neighbors. These gestures were tiny, but they kept despair from swallowing everything. The resilience of the human spirit flickered even in the darkest rooms. Some turned to faith for strength. Churches were crowded on Sundays, not only with prayers for salvation, but with sighs of exhaustion, with unspoken pleas for relief. Hymns rose softly, voices cracked with fatigue, but still the songs carried. In the rhythm of the words, in the warmth of the gathering, many found at least a momentary escape from the silence of despair. Others turned to small pleasures. A mother humming while she mended clothes. A father telling stories of old village life, of green fields and open skies, to children who had never seen them. A boy carving a toy from a scrap of wood, a girl singing to her doll made of rags. These fragile moments of beauty softened the heaviness, giving the spirit something to hold on to. But still, the weight pressed down. The mental toll of industrial life was heavy because it was relentless. There was no pause, no holiday, no break to breathe freely. Every day was claimed by labor, and every night by worry. The cycle ground on, and with it ground down the minds of those trapped within it. The silence of the poor was often misunderstood by the wealthy. To them, it seemed like laziness, ignorance, or dullness of mind. They did not see that silence was the only refuge left to the weary. When words were drowned by machines, when hope was cut off by poverty, when exhaustion robbed the tongue of strength, quiet was all that remained. Silent cries carried more truth than any shouted protest. Picture, for a moment, a woman sitting at the edge of her bed late at night. The candle beside her flickers, her children sleep beside her, their breaths shallow and uneven. She holds her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking silently, no sound escaping her lips. She does not weep loudly, because she cannot. She has no energy for it, no space to release the grief. Instead, her sorrow is quiet, heavy, folded deep inside her. Tomorrow she will rise again, and no one will know the weight she carried in that silence. This was the unspoken cost of the Industrial Revolution. Not only broken bodies, but broken spirits. Not only the visible wounds of machines, but the invisible ones etched into hearts and minds. Suffering that could not be measured in wages or hours, but only in silence. And yet, even in this world of broken spirits and silent cries, people endured. They endured because they had to, because children depended on them, because survival itself was an act of courage. Their silence was not emptiness, but resilience. Their cries may have been quiet, but they were real, and they carried the weight of entire generations who lived and labored in the shadow of industry. Part 11. No unions, no voice. For all the hardship of long hours, meager wages, and dangerous conditions, one truth deepened the suffering of industrial workers: they had no voice. The men, women, and children who kept the machines turning had little power to change their fate. The factory owners dictated the hours, set the wages, and enforced the rules. If a worker complained, there was always another desperate soul waiting outside the gate, ready to take their place. The idea of unions, of workers joining together to demand better treatment, was still young. And in many places, it was not only discouraged, it was against the law. Early in the Industrial Revolution, governments feared that groups of workers gathering to protest or organize would spark disorder. Memories of revolutions in Europe, of mobs filling streets, of monarchs overthrown, weighed heavily on those in power. To them, a union was not a plea for fairness, it was a threat. In Britain, laws known as the Combination Acts made it illegal for workers to form associations to demand higher wages or shorter hours. Meetings were broken up by police. Organizers were arrested, fined, or even imprisoned. Employers encouraged this, knowing that as long as workers stood alone, they could be controlled. A man might grumble at his station, but he dared not gather with others to speak louder. The price of protest was too high. Fear silenced many. A single word against a foreman could mean dismissal. A single absence could mean the loss of work entirely. Without savings, without protection, Losing a job meant immediate hunger. The fear of unemployment was as sharp as the fear of injury. It kept heads bowed, voices quiet, and spirits chained to the factory whistle. The press, too, often ignored the cries of workers. Newspapers, owned by wealthy men, focused on the growth of industry, the profits of mills, the marvels of invention. Stories of suffering rarely reached the front page. The pain of the poor was invisible, hidden behind the smoke of chimneys and the closed doors of workshops. Their silence was not only in their own throats, but in the world around them. And yet, the longing for change stirred. In taverns and crowded homes, whispers passed between workers. A man spoke of shorter hours, of safer machines, of wages that could feed a family. A woman spoke of her children, too young to labor, too hungry to rest. These whispers grew into meetings, cautious, hidden, small gatherings where workers dared to imagine life with dignity. But secrecy carried its own dangers. Informers reported meetings to factory owners. Police raided halls. Workers caught organizing were punished harshly, not only to silence them but to set an example. Fear spread quickly, reminding all that their voices carried risk. The silence was not only enforced from above, it grew within communities themselves. Workers, desperate to hold on to what little they had, sometimes mistrusted one another. If a neighbor protested, it might endanger everyone's wages. If a fellow worker spoke too loudly, the whole mill might face punishment. Survival demanded caution, and caution bred quiet. The absence of unions also meant the absence of negotiation. Hours stretched long because no one could resist them. Wages remained low because no one had the power to raise them. Accidents were ignored because no one could demand safety. The factory owners held all the cards, and the workers were left with none. This imbalance shaped daily life in every way. A man might feel anger burning in his chest as he shoveled coal, but he swallowed it. A woman might feel despair as she worked the looms, but she kept her head down. A child might cry from exhaustion, but the tears went unheard. The silence was not chosen. It was forced, pressed upon them by laws, by fear, by necessity. And yet, even silence can carry strength. The workers endured, year after year, their very survival a quiet form of resistance. They whispered to each other, shared bread, comforted neighbors. Their voices might not have risen in protest, but they carried their suffering in ways that could not be entirely erased. In time, the seeds of change began to sprout. Small groups of workers, risking punishment, continued to gather. Some published pamphlets, their words smuggled through streets and read in whispers. Writers and reformers outside the mills began to speak of injustice, describing the lives of the poor with empathy. Slowly, the silence cracked, though never fully in those early years. Picture, for a moment, a group of men and women huddled in a dim room late at night. A single candle flickers, casting shadows on tired faces. They whisper of shorter hours, of fair pay, of laws that might one day protect them. Their voices are low, their eyes dart toward the door, their hearts pounding with both fear and hope. Outside, the streets are quiet, the factory bells silent until dawn. But inside that room, something fragile stirs, a voice rising, however softly, against the silence. This was the reality of workers in the early Industrial Revolution. They had no unions, no protections, no collective power. Their cries were stifled by law, by fear, by poverty. Their silence was not consent, but survival. And yet, within that silence lay the first faint echoes of change, echoes that would one day grow into louder demands. For now, though, the factories roared on, and the workers remained voiceless. Their days were long, their wages meager, their spirits burdened. The whistle called, and they answered, their silence carrying the weight of generations. Part 12. The Children Who Never Grew. Factories did not only consume the labor of children. They consumed their very growth, their strength, their futures. The price of progress was written most cruelly on small bodies, bent before their time, aged before they had truly lived. These were the children who never grew, whose lives were shortened, stunted, or stolen by the demands of industry. From the moment they entered the mills or mines, childhood was stripped away. Boys and girls as young as 6 or 7 rose in the dark each morning, their feet dragging on cobblestones as they hurried toward gates taller than themselves. Their days were as long as those of adults, their pay a fraction, their weariness far greater. They labored in dust and smoke, their lungs filling with poisons that no young body could withstand. Growth faltered quickly. Children who should have stretched tall and strong remained thin, undersized, their limbs weak from exhaustion. Malnutrition added to the toll. With wages so low, meals were meager, bread too dry, potatoes too few, milk often watered down. The body, starved of nourishment, could not grow, even as it was forced to burn energy in endless labor. Pale faces, thin arms, hollow eyes became the common sight of industrial towns. Mortality was high. Diseases that might have been survived by well-fed children often claimed the poor. Infections from small cuts, left untreated, turned deadly. Coughs deepened into tuberculosis. Fevers carried away little ones in crowded rooms where illness spread like fire. Small coffins were carried through narrow streets so often that neighbors scarcely paused in their work to watch. The grief of parents was quiet, folded into the daily struggle to keep the living alive. Accidents in factories added to this tragedy. Fingers severed by looms, limbs crushed by gears, children pulled beneath moving belts. A single moment's hesitation, a stumble of weary legs, and a young life was gone. Mines claimed many, tunnels collapsing, carts crushing, suffocation in dark shafts. Death came swiftly, without warning, and the machines never paused. Even those who survived carried scars. Spines curved from hours of stooping. Chests weakened by dust. Jaws eaten away by chemicals. Eyes dimmed from strain. By adolescence, many looked like old men and women, their bodies marked by labor rather than by play. The phrase "the children who never grew" was not only poetic, but literal. They remained small, frail, shadows of what they might have been. Education was almost impossible. A few hours in Sunday schools could not undo 6 days of labor. Letters blurred before weary eyes, numbers slipped from tired minds. The chance to rise above poverty through learning was stolen, leaving generations trapped in the same cycle of work and want. Childhood curiosity, the spark of imagination, was dimmed beneath the weight of machines. And yet, even in such harshness, children found fragments of play. They laughed in snatched moments, chasing hoops through smoky alleys, skipping rope with frayed cords, inventing games with sticks and stones. Their joy was brief, but it was real, a stubborn spark against the shadows. Laughter rang out in streets where disease lurked, proving that even weary bodies still held a child's spirit. But that spirit was too often short-lived, pressed out of them by hunger and fatigue. Families depended on their wages, however small. Parents who once might have wished for their children to learn, to play, to grow, led them instead to mills and mines because survival demanded it. A child's pennies often made the difference between bread or none, coal or cold. Love was not absent, it was simply bound by poverty. Sending a child to work was an act of desperation, not cruelty. Parents wept in private, but hunger silenced hope. Reformers began to notice. Writers described the pale, thin faces of mill children, the hollow coughs of mining boys, the rows of tiny graves. Campaigners called for laws to limit hours, to set a minimum age for work, to offer at least some protection. Their voices grew slowly, often drowned by the roar of industry, but they carried truth. A society that consumed its children so greedily could not call itself just. Still, change was far away. For most of the early industrial years, children remained bound to labor. Their lives were short, their bodies fragile, their futures dim. They were the invisible fuel of industry, cheaper than coal, easier to replace than broken machinery. Their suffering was hidden behind factory walls, behind the glowing pride of nations boasting of progress. Picture, for a moment, a boy of 9, sitting on a stool beside a spinning frame. His feet barely touch the ground, his hands dart quickly to catch threads before they snap. Dust swirls around him, his cough rattles in his chest, his eyes droop with fatigue. He should be running in fields, learning his letters, laughing with friends. Instead, he sits in shadows, his growth stunted, his future already slipping away. This was the fate of countless children, to labor until their bodies broke, to sicken before their time, to lie in graves before reaching manhood or womanhood. They were the children who never grew, whose lives were shortened and reshaped by the hunger of industry. And yet, their stories remain. In their silence, they remind us of the true cost of progress. The mills produced cloth, the mines produced coal, the foundries produced steel, but they also consumed lives, stealing childhood itself. Part 13. The Fires of Resistance. For many years, silence ruled the factories. The roar of machines drowned every voice, the threat of dismissal silenced every complaint, and laws punished even the hint of organization. Workers bent their heads, endured their hours, and carried their suffering quietly. Yet silence, however deep, cannot last forever. Beneath the weight of soot and exhaustion, something began to stir. Whispers passed between men and women, words carried softly from loom to loom, from mine shaft to crowded street. The whispers were dangerous, but they carried hope. The earliest sparks of resistance often came in simple complaints. A worker muttered about unfair pay. Another cursed under his breath at the endless hours. A mother, watching her child collapse in fatigue, whispered of injustice. These words, though small, carried truth, and truth has a way of spreading. In taverns after shifts, workers leaned close, voices low, sharing grievances. Around water pumps, women compared the smallness of their wages and the weight of their burdens. In the corners of mills, children whispered about friends injured or lost to machines. The fear of punishment remained sharp. Owners employed informers, and a single overheard word could lead to dismissal. Yet even fear could not erase the growing knowledge that their suffering was not theirs alone. The hunger, the fatigue, the endless hours, all were shared, and in that sharing lay the first fragile sense of unity. Strikes, sudden refusals to work, began to appear, rare at first, but powerful in their daring. Entire groups of workers would lay down their tools, the clatter of machinery stilled by human will. For a brief moment, the balance shifted. Owners who had counted on silence were forced to notice the power of many voices joined together. These strikes were risky. Police were called, soldiers sometimes marched in. Workers were beaten, jailed, blacklisted. Families starved as wages were withheld. But even when crushed, the strikes left behind a lesson that resistance was possible, that voices raised in unison could not be entirely ignored. Some protests took the form of marches. Crowds of men, women, and even children filled streets, carrying banners, chanting for shorter hours, for safer conditions, for the right to live as human beings rather than as cogs in machines. Their voices echoed against factory walls, rising above the smoke. Authorities often responded with force, but the sound of protest could not be erased once it had been heard. Writers and reformers outside the factories lent their voices to the cause. They described the suffering of workers in books, pamphlets, and speeches, carrying news of their struggles to those who might never set foot in a mill. Illustrations of pale, thin children, of men stooped by labor, of women with weary eyes, stirred sympathy among the wider public. Slowly, the cries of workers, once silenced, began to find allies. Women played a vital role in this resistance. They organized gatherings, led petitions, and spoke boldly despite the risks. Their wages were lowest, their burdens greatest, and their courage often strongest. In some towns, women marched at the front of protests, carrying their children with them as living proof of suffering. Their voices rang out in streets, demanding not charity but justice. Still, the fires of resistance were fragile. Owners struck back with threats and punishments. Police broke up meetings, confiscated pamphlets, jailed leaders. Laws remained harsh, branding unions as criminal conspiracies. Yet even crushed movements left behind embers. The idea of fairness, once whispered, could not be unspoken. Solidarity began to take root. Workers realized that while one man alone could be dismissed, many together could not be ignored so easily. Families began to support one another during strikes, sharing bread, caring for each other's children. Communities grew closer, bound not only by suffering but by hope for change. Picture, for a moment, a group of workers gathered in a dim hall at night. The windows are shuttered, a candle burns low, and the air is thick with tension. A man speaks of shorter hours, of the right to rest. A woman speaks of her child, too weak to work another day. Heads nod in the shadows. The risk is great, discovery could mean ruin, but still they speak. And in that room, in that moment, silence is broken. These were the fires of resistance, small, flickering, often stamped out, but always rekindled. They burned in whispered conversations, in secret meetings, in strikes that shook the rhythm of machines. They burned in the courage of those who dared to hope for a different world, even when that hope cost them dearly. The Industrial Revolution demanded silence, but the workers began to find their voices. Quiet at first, then louder, their cries for justice grew, carried forward by courage and necessity. Change was not yet won, but the fires of resistance had been lit, and they would not be extinguished. Part 14. Dreams of Change. For years, the story of the worker had been one of silence, exhaustion, and endurance. Yet, even in the darkest mills and the most crowded streets, the idea of something different began to take shape. Dreams of change stirred, fragile, uncertain, but real. They came from the whispers of workers, the pens of writers, the voices of reformers, and the slow turning of society's conscience. The suffering of the poor could not remain hidden forever. Visitors to industrial towns carried away shocking impressions. Children bent over machines, women pale and weary, men coughing their lives away in the shadow of chimneys. Some of these visitors were writers, poets, and thinkers, who poured their outrage into books and pamphlets. They painted vivid pictures of the lives of workers, describing not only the noise of machines but the silence of despair, not only the soot of chimneys but the hunger of children. Their words traveled beyond the factory gates, stirring sympathy in people who had never felt the weight of a mill whistle. Charles Dickens, Elizabeth Gaskell, and others wrote stories where workers were not faceless masses, but living souls. Their novels showed the wealthy what life was like in the slums, what it meant to grow up in hunger, what it meant to see childhood lost to labor. These stories did not erase suffering, but they made it visible, harder to ignore. For some, reading such words was the first time they understood that progress had a price. Reformers also began to act. Some were politicians, pressing for laws to limit child labor, to shorten the endless hours of mills. Others were church leaders, calling upon moral duty to protect the weakest. Campaigners gathered signatures, spoke in parliament, and risked ridicule from those who insisted industry must be left alone. Their victories were small at first, but they were victories nonetheless. The Factory Acts in Britain were among the earliest signs of change. They limited the working hours of children and later, cautiously, of women. At first the limits were modest. A child might still work 10 hours a day, but the idea itself was revolutionary. It was the beginning of a recognition that workers were not merely hands for machines, but human beings whose bodies and spirits required protection. Education, too, began to emerge as a dream. Reformers argued that children should be in schools, not factories. Sunday schools had given a taste of learning, but reformers imagined more, a system where every child, no matter how poor, could read, write, and prepare for a life beyond the loom or the mine. It was a vision of a different future, where the cycle of poverty might be broken. Not all welcomed these dreams. Factory owners protested bitterly, claiming that laws would ruin industry, that shorter hours would destroy profits, that education would make children disobedient. Many politicians agreed, fearing that change would weaken the nation's economic strength. Yet the voices of reformers persisted, their arguments growing stronger as evidence of suffering became harder to deny. The fires of resistance among workers and the dreams of reformers outside the mills began to meet. Together, they formed the first fragile bridge toward change. Strikes and protests continued, now supported by public sympathy. Pamphlets spread ideas faster, newspapers printed debates, and Parliament found itself unable to ignore the growing outcry. Even within families, dreams of change began to stir. Parents spoke of wishing more for their children, of hoping they might escape the factory floor. Mothers whispered of education, fathers spoke of dignity, children themselves dreamed of days spent in play rather than labor. These were simple dreams, but they carried power. Hope, once imagined, is difficult to extinguish. Picture, for a moment, a group of reformers gathered in a candlelit study. Papers are scattered across a table, petitions filled with signatures. One man reads aloud the story of a child crushed in a mill. Another describes a family starving despite endless hours of work. Their voices are low, but determined. They imagine a world where laws protect the weak, where work is fair, where children grow tall and strong. It is only a vision, fragile and uncertain, but it glows in the room like the candle flame itself, a small light against deep shadow. Change came slowly, and often imperfectly. Laws were passed, but many owners ignored them. Inspectors were few, punishments weak, enforcement lax. Still, the very existence of such laws was a sign that the world was shifting. Where once there had been only silence, now there was debate. Where once there had been only despair, now there was a hint of hope. The dreams of change also extended beyond factories. Campaigners fought for cleaner streets, for safe water, for public health. Doctors wrote of disease in slums, engineers proposed saws, city planners imagined parks and fresh air. The vision of a better life widened, no longer limited to shorter hours but to healthier homes, safer streets, and dignity in daily existence. These dreams did not erase the suffering of the present. Children still coughed in mills, families still crowded into dark rooms, accidents still claimed lives. But alongside the roar of machines, another sound began to grow. The sound of hope, whispered in novels, spoken in speeches, carried in the voices of those who refused to accept endless suffering as natural. The workers themselves carried these dreams, even when they seemed far away. A mother might tuck her child into bed and whisper, "Someday you'll learn to read." A father might tell his son, "Perhaps you'll have a life better than mine." These were not promises, only hopes, but they were powerful. They kept despair from claiming everything. This was the age of dreams of change, fragile, imperfect, often resisted, but real. The mills still thundered, the smoke still rose, the wages still fell short. Yet in the hearts of many, there was now a vision of something more, a world where children could grow, where workers could rest, where life meant more than endless labor. The Industrial Revolution had reshaped the world with machines and smoke. But in its shadows, people began to reshape it again, with voices, with courage, with dreams. Part 15: Shadows and Seeds. The story of the Industrial Revolution is often told as one of triumph, of machines that spun faster than hands, of engines that carried goods across nations, of wealth that grew in cities lit by gaslight. But behind the triumph lay another story, the shadows of workers who gave their strength, their health, their very lives to feed the hungry engines of progress. Their suffering was not only a tragedy of their time, it was also the soil from which change would grow. The shadows of their lives were long. They stretched across factories filled with noise, across mines sunk deep in darkness, across tenements crowded with families who lived more in survival than in rest. For decades, their cries were silent, their burdens unseen, their hopes fragile. Yet in those shadows, seeds of transformation were planted, seeds watered by pain, nurtured by resilience, and carried forward by courage. Every child who collapsed at a loom, every man who coughed in a mine, every woman who carried both a baby and a basket of coal left a mark on history. Their endurance forced questions to be asked. How much suffering could a nation demand of its people? How much profit could be justified by hunger? How long could childhood itself be consumed by machines? These questions grew louder, and though change came slowly, it came nonetheless. Laws began to appear, small at first, almost timid. The Factory Acts limited the hours of children, then women, then all workers. 10 hours became the standard day, then 8, though many employers resisted fiercely. Mines were regulated, schools expanded, inspectors appointed. None of it erased suffering, but each measure chipped away at the silence, acknowledging at last that workers were human beings with rights as well as duties. Unions, once forbidden, gained strength. Workers joined together, their voices rising in unison, no longer whispers but shouts that echoed through streets and parliaments. Strikes grew larger, petitions gathered signatures, leaders emerged who would not be silenced. The seed of solidarity, planted in the darkest years, blossomed into a force powerful enough to change nations. Health, too, became a concern. Doctors spoke of disease in slums, engineers designed saws and water systems, reformers demanded clean air and safe housing. The shadows of sickness, once ignored, led to new visions of public health. Parks were built, hospitals opened, sanitation improved. It was not kindness that drove these changes, but necessity. The suffering of workers had shown that a nation could not thrive if its people were broken. Education expanded, slowly at first, then more quickly. Children who once tied threads in mills began to learn letters and numbers in classrooms. Their minds, once dulled by fatigue, now reached for knowledge. The seeds of opportunity, long buried, began to sprout. A generation that might have been lost entirely found a chance, however fragile, to grow. None of this erased the past. The suffering of those early workers remained etched in history. They were the children who never grew, the women who carried double burdens, the men who coughed their lungs to dust. Their lives were shortened, their dreams stolen, their spirits bent. Yet from their pain came progress. From their silence came voices. From their endurance came rights that millions enjoy today. The weekend, once unthinkable, became reality. Paid holidays, once a dream, became law. The 8-hour day, once mocked, became standard. Unions grew strong, able to negotiate, to demand, to protect. The protections we now take for granted, safety rails, clean water, child labor laws, all were born in the shadows of the Industrial Revolution. Picture, for a moment, a mill in its first years. The machines roar, children dart between them, men and women bend over looms. The air is thick, the hours endless, the wages too small. Now picture, years later, the same building transformed. The machines are quieter, guarded by rails. The workers leave after 8 hours, not 16. Children no longer labor at the looms, but learn in schools. The change did not come easily, and it came too late for many, but it came nonetheless. The seeds of change, once planted, spread across the world. Nations watched one another, borrowing laws, adapting reforms, strengthening protections. Workers in one country inspired workers in another, their voices carrying across oceans. What began as whispers in crowded mills became a global movement, reshaping societies. And yet, the shadows remain. Even today, in different corners of the world, echoes of those early factories can still be found. Long hours, unsafe conditions, wages too low to live on. The struggle for dignity is never fully finished. The seeds planted in the 19th century still grow, still spread, still demand care. But for those who endured the first fires of industry, their legacy is clear. They did not live to see the full fruits of their suffering, but their endurance ensured that others would. They bore the weight of shadows so that later generations could step into a world with a little more light. As night settles on this story, imagine the workers of those early factories. Men, women, and children walking home through streets darkened by smoke, their shoulders stooped, their eyes weary. They did not know that their suffering would one day change the world. They knew only survival. Yet in their footsteps, in their silence, in their cries, the seeds of justice were planted. This is the legacy of the Industrial Revolution's workers. Shadows and seeds. Shadows of suffering, yes, but also seeds of change, carried forward by courage, watered by endurance, and grown into the rights and protections we know today. And so, as the last whistle fades into memory, the story closes softly. Not with triumph, not with despair, but with the quiet recognition that even in the darkest times, human endurance carries within it the power to plant seeds of a better world.